Something happened in the Persian Gulf that Iranian state media has not been able to explain away, and that most coverage still has not fully processed. A guided missile destroyer turned into the wind, opened its vertical launch cells, and began firing. Wave after wave of Tomahawk cruise missiles, according to U.S. officials, climbing into the night sky and arcing toward radar stations, command bunkers, and IRGC infrastructure scattered across the length of Iran. Not just the coastline, not just the Strait, deep into the interior. And then came an announcement that Tehran had reportedly been dreading since this war reignited. Not another strike, not another round of sanctions. A declaration that the terminal handling roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, the financial artery of the Islamic Republic, could come under direct American control. Not temporarily, not as a bargaining chip, as a permanent strategic acquisition. If you're enjoying this analysis, don't forget to subscribe to Cartovex Media, because the next few minutes completely change the picture. Because to understand how a helicopter crash in the Gulf of Oman turned into a fight over who owns Iran's oil revenue, you have to go back to the beginning of this specific chapter. And you have to understand why Tehran's inability to bring anything coherent to the negotiating table isn't really a diplomatic failure. It may be the predictable output of a command structure that has run one playbook for nearly 5 decades and doesn't appear to know how to run another. The trigger, according to U.S. Central Command and multiple American officials, was an Iranian drone striking a U.S. Army AH-64 Apache helicopter as it patrolled near the Strait of Hormuz. The aircraft went down in the waters off the coast of Oman. Both crew members ended up in the water, and what happened next had reportedly never been done before in the history of American combat search and rescue. An uncrewed surface vessel, not a helicopter, not a conventional rescue boat, but an autonomous drone boat operated under U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, reached the crash site and pulled both aviators from the Gulf. U.S. officials described it as the first time an unmanned surface vessel had ever been used to execute a personnel rescue at sea. Both pilots survived. Both were reported uninjured. But here's what almost nobody outside defense circles fully absorbed about that moment. For the first time in a modern combat theater, a machine with no one aboard it saved the lives of the people who were supposed to be saving everyone else. That detail alone tells you how far this war has already moved past a conventional playbook. Washington's read on the incident was blunt. Trump said the military had informed him Iran was responsible and vowed the United States would respond. Iranian officials, according to reporting at the time, offered no clear acknowledgement, and the exact circumstances, deliberate strike or accident, remained, in the words of U.S. officials, still under investigation. But the clock had already started, and what that clock triggered was a renewed, multi-night wave of American strikes that pushed deeper into Iranian territory than anything since the opening days of Operation Epic Fury back in February. Night 1 read like a calibrated opening statement. U.S. Air Force and Navy strike packages targeted Iranian air defense batteries, radar installations, and command infrastructure ringing the Strait and extending further inland. CENTCOM's language was careful. A proportional response, officials said, to recent attacks on American forces and international shipping. Proportional, targeted, methodical. That was the official framing. But proportional openings in this conflict have a pattern. They tend to be followed by something much larger. Iran's answer followed a script the IRGC has run through several previous rounds of this war. Iranian state media and IRGC channels claim strikes against American positions and partner bases across the Gulf, claims that, as with earlier phases of the conflict, were difficult to independently verify and, according to CENTCOM, were in some cases directly disputed. Independent fact-checkers, reviewing footage tied to some of these claims during earlier phases of the war, found at least one widely shared image had been recycled from an unrelated incident years earlier. That doesn't mean nothing hit. Iranian missile and drone launches toward U.S. partner nations in the Gulf have been documented repeatedly. It means the fog of information around exactly what landed where has been thick on both sides. But here's the analytical detail that matters more than any single Iranian claim. Multiple reports over the course of this war have suggested Iran's ballistic missile stockpiles have been severely depleted from pre-conflict levels, some estimates putting the decline in the range of the vast majority of what existed before February. If accurate, that reframes everything you're watching. An institution that once built its entire regional deterrent architecture around the threat of massed missile salvos is now, according to this reporting, launching smaller batches and spacing them days apart. That is not patience. That's an institution counting what it has left. Then came Night 2, intensifying the pattern, deeper strikes on Iranian air defense architecture, more command nodes going dark. And then, according to reporting at the time, the U.S. Secretary of Defense delivered a line that functioned almost like a trailer for what was coming. "We will be busy tonight." 3 words. And to anyone tracking the operational rhythm of this campaign, those 3 words meant one thing: the largest strike package yet was being assembled. Now let's talk about what a large coordinated Tomahawk salvo actually represents, because the raw number matters less than what the weapon can do. A Tomahawk is not a dumb bomb dropped and hoped for the best. It's a GPS-updated, terrain-following, precision-guided cruise missile capable of traveling hundreds of miles at low altitude and striking within meters of a programmed target. It can be redirected mid-flight. It can be aimed at one specific structure inside a much larger facility. Multiple Tomahawks fired from a single platform in a single night, according to reporting from this stage of the conflict, translates into dozens of near-simultaneous precision effects landing across the depth of Iranian territory in the same hour. Not a single blunt strike, but a distributed, coordinated one. And the Tomahawks reportedly weren't flying alone. Alongside them, according to open-source military tracking, F-16 CJ Wild Weasel aircraft, platforms built for one job: hunting enemy radar. The moment an Iranian air defense operator switches on a radar to search the sky for incoming threats, that operator paints a target onto his own position. Anti-radiation missiles home in on the emission itself. Behind that suppression layer, F-15E Strike Eagles are reported to have carried some of the heaviest precision ordnance in the American tactical inventory, including penetrating munitions built specifically to reach targets buried underground. Above it all, F-35s and carrier-launched F-18 Super Hornets, tracking the Iranian response in real time and feeding it back into the next targeting cycle. Layer after layer, each platform doing one job, in sequence, across hundreds of miles of contested airspace. But that's only part of the story, because the most consequential sentence of this entire war wasn't spoken by a general. It came from a social media post. President Trump said publicly that Kharg Island and other Iranian oil infrastructure could be taken and placed under American control of Iran's oil and gas markets, drawing an explicit comparison to how the United States has approached oversight of Venezuelan oil revenue. That sentence is not a military escalation in the ordinary sense. It's a declaration of an entirely different kind of objective. Every strike in this campaign up to that point had been framed, officially, in the language of maritime security, protecting shipping lanes, degrading Iran's ability to threaten the Strait, enforcing a blockade against a regime accused of attacking commercial vessels. Taking Kharg Island and asserting control over Iran's oil exports is a different category of action entirely. It isn't destruction, it's acquisition. Not bombing a facility into rubble, but taking the switch that decides where nearly 1 million barrels a day, and the revenue that comes with it, actually goes. To understand why that matters this much, you need to understand what Kharg Island actually is. It's a small coral island in the northern Persian Gulf, roughly 8 kilometers long, sitting off Iran's coast. And through its pipelines and offshore loading terminals passes the overwhelming majority of Iran's crude oil exports, reportedly around 90%, according to Britannica and multiple outlets covering the war. In March 2026, U.S. airstrikes hit more than 90 military targets on the island, munition storage, naval assets used to threaten the Strait, while, according to Britannica's reporting, deliberately sparing the oil terminal itself. That distinction was intentional. Destroying the terminal removes leverage. Controlling it creates leverage. And in June, Trump made explicit on Truth Social what analysts had been speculating about for weeks, that the U.S. intended, at some point, to take Kharg Island and other oil infrastructure points and assume control of Iran's oil and gas markets outright. For the IRGC's leadership, that is not a battlefield threat, it's an existential one. Losing the revenue that flows through Kharg doesn't just hurt the military, it starves the entire patronage network the IRGC has built over decades. Funding for regional proxy groups from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, salaries for its own personnel, procurement budgets for weapons programs, the financial glue holding together its dominant position inside Iran's own power structure. A missile stockpile can, in theory, be rebuilt over years. A revenue stream that has been physically seized and redirected cannot simply be waited out. This is where everything changes about how you should read the earlier ceasefire. Iran had already lived through one pause in this war, a memorandum of understanding reached in mid-June that briefly quieted the fighting and reopened talk of reopening the Strait. According to Britannica's account of the conflict, Iran instead used that window to test the edges of the agreement, warning ships to follow its own preferred routes, attempting to assert fee-collecting authority over transit through the Strait, and ultimately firing on commercial vessels in early July, actions the United States treated as a direct violation, prompting the collapse of the truce and a return to strikes. The pattern of using a pause to reposition rather than de-escalate is, according to multiple outlets tracking the war, exactly what played out. But repositioning missiles is one thing. There is no equivalent playbook for repositioning an oil terminal that is no longer under your control. So what does the IRGC actually want out of all this? Not control of the Strait for its own sake. The Strait is leverage, a choke point used to extract concessions from a United States with enormous economic and political stakes in Gulf energy stability. The deeper objective, according to years of non-proliferation analysis and reporting on Iran's nuclear ambitions, is institutional survival through eventual nuclear weapons capability. Use the leverage to force a reduced American footprint in the region, use that breathing room to complete a weapons program, and govern indefinitely from behind the deterrent that a nuclear arsenal provides. Iran has consistently maintained its nuclear program is peaceful. The United States and Israel have just as consistently said they believe otherwise, citing Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. That gap between Tehran's stated position and Washington's stated red line is not a matter of translation or diplomatic finesse. It's a structural incompatibility that no amount of shuttle diplomacy through Doha or Muscat appears able to bridge. That's the real danger sitting underneath every headline about talks stalling. Iran's public-facing diplomats, foreign ministry officials, negotiators who show up to regional capitals, are, according to most analysis of the war's diplomatic track, operating with limited authority to bind the actual decision-making power inside Tehran, which rests with the IRGC and the country's senior leadership. A deal that satisfies Washington's minimum conditions on the nuclear file is, by most expert accounts, incompatible with what the IRGC considers acceptable for its own survival. And when the actors empowered to negotiate can't agree with the actors empowered to decide, the diplomacy isn't failing, it's structurally unable to succeed. Now here's the part of this war that almost never makes the headlines, but explains everything about how the campaign is actually being fought: the underground problem. During the earlier ceasefire, Iran used the pause, according to open-source military analysis, to move as much of its remaining missile inventory and command infrastructure underground as possible, into hardened storage, into mountain shelters far from the coastal facilities that absorbed the first phase of American strikes. That changes the entire targeting equation. A surface radar site can be destroyed with a single precision munition. A hardened underground bunker requires an entirely different category of weapon: heavier, deeper penetrating ordnance, and an intelligence picture precise enough to know exactly where the facility sits and how it's built.
What happened next reportedly surprised even seasoned analysts. U.S. forces have been described as identifying newly constructed underground sites before their concrete had even finished curing. A level of persistent surveillance combining satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and other monitoring methods that leaves very little room for Iran to hide reconstitution efforts. If that reporting holds up, it means the fundamental premise of Iran's underground strategy, buy time by hiding what's left, is being undercut in real time. Running alongside the military campaign is a second front that gets far less attention: the blockade. U.S. forces have enforced restrictions on shipping into and out of Iranian ports, described by American officials as intended to last, in the words of one Pentagon official, as long as it takes. Commercial vessels attempting to defy naval warnings have, according to reporting on the conflict, faced direct consequences. The message to shipping operators considering a run at Iranian ports has been unambiguous. Combine a maritime blockade with the threatened seizure of Iran's primary oil export terminal, and you get something military strikes alone can't produce: a financial encirclement. Strikes destroy capability. Cutting off the money destroys the reason to keep fighting. But that's only part of the picture, because this war doesn't stay contained to the Gulf. Oil markets have reacted sharply to every major escalation in this conflict. Brent crude spiking on days of intensified strikes, at one point reportedly settling near its highest level since mid-June, according to market reporting tied to the war's timeline. European governments, whose energy security is directly tied to Gulf stability and who have largely maintained a cautious distance from direct involvement in the American campaign, now have a growing stake in how the fight over Kharg Island resolves. If operational control over a facility handling this much of the world's oil-adjacent trade shifts hands, the pricing and distribution consequences ripple far beyond the Gulf itself. So where does this actually leave the conflict as of the most recent reporting? The ceasefire that briefly held in the spring collapsed by early July after Iran, according to Britannica's account, tested its limits by firing on commercial shipping. CENTCOM has continued reporting intercepted drone launches toward the Strait. The Pentagon's own casualty figures for the operation have continued to be updated as the fighting drags on, with independent trackers reporting figures that in some cases diverge from official tallies. A reminder that even the basic accounting of this war remains contested in places. Trump has, according to multiple outlets, floated the idea of the United States effectively becoming the guardian of the Strait itself, and reportedly discussed imposing a toll on vessels transiting it, an idea that, if pursued, would represent as significant a restructuring of Gulf commerce as anything achieved by force. Here's the honest strategic assessment. Iran is fighting a war that, by the account of most open-source analysis, it appears increasingly unable to win militarily, fund indefinitely, or resolve diplomatically. Not because its negotiators lack skill, but because the institution actually holding decision-making power has objectives that may be fundamentally incompatible with anything Washington is willing to accept. Its missile stockpiles, by multiple accounts, are a shadow of what they were in February. Its coastal military infrastructure has been repeatedly struck. Its underground reconstitution efforts are reportedly being located before they're even finished. Its primary financial artery has been publicly named as a potential American acquisition. And its ultimate strategic insurance policy, a nuclear deterrent, has been explicitly ruled unacceptable by the American president. The IRC's operating theory throughout this war seems to have been simple: outlast the pressure long enough to force a pause, use the pause to rebuild, and repeat until exhaustion sets in on the other side. That theory survived roughly 5 decades of sanctions, isolation, and limited military exchanges. It has never been tested against a campaign that simultaneously targets its weapons, its hiding places, and the money that pays for all of it at once. Whether that theory survives this round of the war, or whether Kharg Island becomes the moment it finally runs out of road, may be the single most important open question left in this conflict. And it's one that neither side, right now, appears able to answer with any certainty.